The idea that people weren't eating enough bread has been this sort of steady drumbeat, but the numbers over the last 4 or 5 years have really become concerning. And so the question is whether or not we can muster what it will take to really sort of change the trend. And history says no.
That was Josh Sosland, editor of Milling and Baking News and president of Sosland Publishing Company. This is the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, we're very pleased to have Josh Sosland, who is the president of Sosland Publishing Company and the editor of Milling and Baking News industry publication, which I'm sure most people listening to the podcast are very familiar with. It's a go-to for a lot of information that we use around here at Kansas Wheat, that's for sure. Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So you joined Sosland Publishing in 1983. You're a Harvard graduate, but the family history obviously goes back for more than a century. So give our listeners a brief explanation of the history of Sosland Publishing. How did you all get started?
Well, so my grandfather started it with two of his brothers. The older of the brothers was an immigrant. His father and mother moved from Russia after they'd already had a couple of kids and ended up having 8 kids, and 3 of them got together and started a magazine known as the Southwestern Miller that really focused on the milling industry, baking industry, and of course the grain industry in Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Colorado, and Texas. None of them had gone to college. They were all bright guys and working as freelance journalists, and they were approached by the local milling industry because of changes that were already transpiring with wheat in the Southwest and the milling industry in the Southwest. Pretty much at that point, all the flour that was produced by Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma mills was used for family flour. It was used for home baking. And home baking was dominant at that point. But even in the early 1920s, people could see things were changing. Industrial commercial baking was growing. More and more households were buying their bread at the supermarket rather than baking it at home. And the millers believed that Kansas in particular, but the Southwest, produced a high enough quality wheat that it belonged in commercially produced bread flour. At that point, the commercial bread flour depended overwhelmingly on spring wheat. They believed if you want quality wheat, you needed to be buying it from North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, or Montana, and the millers here knew otherwise. And so the other parts of the country had magazines to promote their trade magazines for sort of the B2B aspect of milling. That wasn't necessary in the Southwest because the mills were producing a consumer product. And so to get the industry to understand the Kansas flour made a really good loaf of bread, they wanted their own trade magazine, and so that's how the Southwestern Miller was created.
And this is right in line with hard red winter wheat really exploding in the southern plains, brought over by the Mennonites in the late 1800s, really exploding in the early 1900s, right?
Yeah, I think they had a really good run of usage. I mean, Kansas was already a very large producing state, but you probably sell to the easiest, most readily available customer, and that was the housewife. And that really ate up all of the wheat that was being produced in this part of the country.
It's incredible how that has evolved from the publication and having the opportunity to be at the Board of Trade when you were at the Board of Trade back in the day, and knowing that from a milling standpoint, just the daily information that gets relied on by the industry, just such an integral part of the overall industry that Milling and Baking News and Sosland Publishing and internationally now plays. And I'm always, had the opportunity to know your Uncle Morton, and someday I hope you were able to take enough time to write a book and turn it into a Netflix series about the great grain robbery and how Sosland Publishing was able to scoop the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and to me, that has the makings of a Netflix series or a spy thriller drama someday, Josh.
Morton wrote a brief relative to a book, sort of a brief summary of what transpired. And it really was a little bit of a spy thriller, and this was in the early 1970s. And if you'd like, we can probably put a link to his article. But it really was a very important economic event for this country in the early 1970s, and we have very much echoes of it today, just how disruptive inflation can be. And for your listeners who might not be aware of the story, basically the Russians very quietly came in and bought far more grain, a lot of wheat, a lot of corn than had ever happened before, than anyone had thought possible. And they did it basically telling each of the suppliers that they were the sole supplier so that they wouldn't freak out markets. And by the time markets really figured out what was going on and how much grain was leaving the country, they had their grain bought cheap, and suddenly we were facing inflation like we'd never seen before, and that combined with the Arab oil embargo associated with the 1973 war between Israel and Egypt brought in an era of inflation that we largely forgot about, but people very much remember it now, and it's associated with very similar developments, oil market disruptions and food market disruptions.
That's referred to as the Great Grain Robbery at the time, and it had so many consequences as congressionally mandated sales reporting. That was the foundation for creating the WASDE report and having transparent information that came out. And I'm not for sure. In my mind, I think I credit Morton with coining the phrase "the Great Grain Robbery," but I don't know if he did or not. But
I'm not sure whether he did. But in the middle of the purchases were made over the course of a summer, and at a certain point, he started receiving a call from someone who identified himself as John Smith, and John Smith claimed he was from the Financial Times, said he had numbers about imports of or grain purchases by Russia from the United States, and wanted to run them by Morton. And Morton said, well, those don't make any sense, and really didn't start publishing them until whatever reporting was mandated at that point, and maybe it was the grain inspections, or I'm not really sure what, but affirmed that the numbers were spot on. And so over the course of the summer, the guy continued to call, feed him numbers, and they all turned out to be right, and that was really how we broke the story. So we broke in, and I was 11 years old at the time.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Josh. I do think that's a very amazing time and just very historical time in the grain industry, but for your family, I know it's very significant.
So when Morton took over in 1968, Josh, and that's when the company kind of grew, is that correct? How many publications are in-house now under Sosland?
Okay, so that seems like a layup question. Because we have some digital but there's several. So there's World Grain, Baking and Snack, Pet Food Processing, Milling and Baking News, Food Business News. There's a Dairy Processing magazine. So it's, more than a handful, and many newsletters. And we do a daily market focus, which, gives sort of wheat basis, export information, bakery flour information, and a sweetener newsletter as well.
How have you kept the print business going, kind of in an era where there's not a lot of magazines? I know you have digital versions of everything. What makes the print part of it have staying power, do you think?
I mean, we're really following our readership, and our readership is maybe a little more traditional. They still seem to like print, and many of our advertisers like print as well. The readership is migrating more and more toward digital, and in fact, we're announcing that Food Business News is really dialing back its print and, devoting even more resources toward digital. But people still like to hold magazines, generally speaking.
Well, you're certainly seen as industry experts and having a century of archives to look back at, to cycles of the industry. How does where the industry stands today, specifically the baking and milling industry, it's facing a lot of challenges. Anything you can recall in recent history that's similar to the position where it is now?
Well, the idea that the baking industry faces challenges, I am the person who's written our archive page for the last 30 years, and since we started it in the late 90s. And the problem that people aren't eating enough bread has never gone away, and it's been addressed fits and starts with lots of enthusiasm that quickly wanes, just over and over and over again. I'm just struck every time I read about some initiative that was announced in 1927, and so you're so excited about where it's going to go, and these were by captains of the industry, really impressive people, and they just sputtered out over and over and over again. So that would be one thing that seems particularly germane now, because the idea that people weren't eating enough bread has been this sort of steady drumbeat, but the numbers over the last 4 or 5 years have really become concerning, and so the question is whether or not we can muster what it will take to really sort of change the trend. And history says no, and I think it's important that people understand that history, because it really teaches us that business as usual is not going to affect the kind of change that we really need.
So if history says no, that we can't change that trend, a couple of years back, the industry tried to do a wheat flour foods checkoff, and that wasn't as successful ultimately. Kind of walk us through what happened. You were close to that topic, and since that's happened about 4 years ago, what do you see the opportunities or cost of not having a program like that?
Well, so the first part of the question is long and complicated in terms of trying to recount what transpired. And frankly, behind closed doors, I don't know everything that transpired. It seemed to be on track. They seemed to have the votes in place. They seemed to be kind of doing everything that USDA required to get a checkoff program established. But from the beginning, there were naysayers, for lots of different reasons. There was concerns about USDA being able to look into people's financials, or whatever they would need to be able to establish everybody's share of the checkoff program. This is an industry that in lots of ways has experience that makes them very wary of government involvement in any part of their business. And even though basically the rest of the food chain, very few exceptions, has checkoff programs to promote whatever part of share of stomach they're going for, and we don't, really it was hard to get over that kind of mistrust. And the value-added piece, bakers and the millers paying for this versus your prime constituents, the grain people, that was a little bit of an unusual way of trying to get this done. But organizationally, the American Bakers Association has worked very, very hard to create cohesiveness, and between its larger members and its smaller members, between the food service people and those who make commercial bread for the supermarket. And it probably was a minority, but it was a vocal enough minority that at the end of the day, I think the bakers decided unity was more important than pursuing a program that probably the majority of the bakers believed was important to make a reality.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Josh. I know we were all kind of watching the Bread Basket Checkoff. From a producer standpoint, we were more on the outside of it and kind of engaging the industry, but we were certainly from Kansas excited about that opportunity, the idea of the industry having a significant amount of resources on an aligned message to be able to speak on behalf to consumers about our products. And it would have been change, but it would have been, looking back on it and where we're at today with some of the challenges that we're facing, boy, it would sure help with that messaging in the industry and in responding to some of the challenges that we're facing. But I certainly can understand the complexity with that. As you know, even from the producer standpoint, wheat is just a different animal when it comes to getting everybody on the same page. From a producer standpoint, you have 6 classes of wheat with multiple regions with different end product uses and customer bases, and it's challenging enough from the producer side. I can understand the industry side of how there was those challenges of getting everybody on board for that, but you can't help but think what it could bring to the table now in response to some of these headwinds that we're facing from GLP-1s or from the MAHA movement, or just negativity that sometimes is getting put out there on social media around bread products. And that's something we have to come together as an industry and figure out without the Bread Basket Checkoff.
I'm probably treading in sensitive waters here, but I think part of the idea behind the creation of the Green Foods Foundation was that the growers might have a different vision of how to promote wheat than the bakers, and that maybe we're in the same water, but we ought to be perhaps in separate boats. And I think what we've learned over the last 20 years is getting in separate boats doesn't eliminate all the challenges. It isn't as if the Wheat Foods Council or the Grain Foods Foundation has had completely easy navigation. The waters are really, really tough.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, and you mentioned in a recent article in one of your columns that the challenge for this industry for many decades now has been combating false information with science. And then comes along something completely different than I don't think there's anything to compare to these new medications, the GLP-1s, where you actually have a medication that eliminates the urge to eat not only food but bread. Have you seen any parallel to what we're facing right now in the past, Josh?
So I have kind of been a GLP-1 skeptic, not that it's not a wonderful medication and that it will help a lot of people, but in terms of, compared to some of the caloric numbers of what sorts of reduction and what sort of impact it was going to have, I thought, and I still think that they've been overstated, but I think I probably was underplaying it. And I think it's impossible to ignore its impact on bread together and other, baked goods together with a lot of foods. I think the entire industry is facing that, the entire food, maybe with a few sort of high protein specialized exceptions. I think the problems that, like GLP-1 wouldn't be really high on my list of what's kind of bringing us down right now.
What needs to be done in terms of being proactive? What kind of investment, let's just set the checkoff aside for a minute, what kind of investment needs to be done by the industry to actually move the needle these days?
Well, I think there are two pieces of this, and one I think is going pretty well. You've got the Grain Foods Foundation, you've got the Grain Foods Research Institute, and I think they're doing the heavy lifting that is necessary to debunk prevailing myths that are out there about bread and other flour-based foods. So I think that's the positive piece. I think they definitely could use more resources, and I know Kansas Wheat and some of the other state wheat commissions have been supportive, but that part really seems on track. The part that doesn't is not that we're not doing enough to win the minds, because I think we're getting that done, but it's what we need to do to win the hearts of consumers. And that is a much more expensive lift, and we're not really doing anything there. I mean, that is what the checkoff was supposed to do. And I was listening to a different podcast not long ago that seemingly has nothing to do with what we're talking about. It's a pasta maker told me about it. It's probably well known. It's called Invest Like the Best, and he talks to different people in the financial and investment industry. And he happened to interview a guy named John Kim, who is in the venture capital area. And he's not a money manager per se. His job is to actually raise funds for venture capital firms. And he was really good at it. He raised billions of dollars. And even he wrote a book about it. But what he said during this podcast that made me think of our industry was the host said, what is the most common mistakes that you see people make as they're trying to raise funds and going to clients and saying, here's why you should trust me with your money. And he said, the most common mistake is super easy. People over-index on logic. It blows me away. Actually, your emotional and your value or your intuitive engine is those things that make you make decisions. The most important thing to remember is if you want to get to yes, it's desire minus fear. But desire and fear are both emotional states, both ethical states. And you have to win the hearts and bodies of the people to get them to the place where they are not instinctively scared. So I am totally a logic person. So that just really, really resonated with me because I've always just been, for God's sakes, they don't have the facts correct. Let's get them the facts. But you read this and it makes sense. He uses the analogy of people intuitively know, statistically, the plane's not going to crash, but they're still scared, And so it's sort of that piece that we have to get. At the ABA annual meeting this year, they announced a $100,000 initiative to help sort of promote grain-based foods, and I think kind of maybe a little more from a policy perspective, but address some of these areas that weren't being addressed. And ABA is not a small organization, but they have to be judicious with their money, and $100,000 is a lot for an association essentially to pull from its coffers. But I sat there thinking, well, that's not going to get the job done, I mean, we really need millions. And as we talked about in the article that you referenced, the baking companies are losing billions and billions of dollars of market share. That is not just sort of a investor cycling out of, well, we're not doing staples right now. They're losing business, they're losing profitability, and their long-term picture has diminished because of what's going on in essentially the most important food staple in the United States. And so what are we really doing to counter that?
So you mentioned earlier, so changing hearts is expensive. I think that's an excellent point. Looking outside this industry, I'm just curious, have you seen someone who's done that right? Who's found a really good way to do that? It's probably not fair to put you on the spot with a question like that.
I think the example people share are around some of the checkoff programs, and some of them really have been successful.
Well, I had the opportunity to be at the Grain Food Foundation board meeting that you presented at and hear some of the research that was going on. One of the things that one of the researchers mentioned was if you look at the per capita consumption of like an avocados or what you're seeing in the dairy industry right now, there are examples of how kind of aligned messaging through backed resources, have won some of those hearts. Mm-hmm. There are those examples out there. So I think it's important for those titans in our industry right now, which we have fewer of, Josh, because of consolidation that's happened across milling and baking over the last 20 and 30 years. It becomes that much more important that we get those major players and key stakeholders and leaders, make sure that we're all aligned in messaging, because it is a competitive industry, but at the end of the day, we're all impacted by these same headwinds for sure.
Yeah. I mean, during that presentation, I gave sort of the counter example as sort of how bad things could get, and that was grapefruits, which when I was a kid was an absolute staple, and now it's just basically gone. And so, the industry is bleeding slowly. I'm a great believer that there's all the reasons in the world we should have a great future, but we can't take it for granted. It can continue to get worse.
Yeah, I think that's a great message, Josh, to wrap this up. One last question for you. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the RFK Jr. factor and the MAHA movement. It's grown into quite the animal, hasn't it?
For sure. And I think, that has really been hovering through our entire conversation, around ultra-processed foods. And the fact that powerful, emotion-laden messages can be very, very effective because the scientific grounding of what's coming out of that movement is really very, very weak. But with little kernels of truth, you can scare people into making pretty dramatic behavioral changes, and we're seeing that.
Yeah, you're such a integral part of the industry. As we look forward and seeing, we had a challenging year on the production side. We are seeing somewhat of a challenging year on the flour consumption and flour side, but we are seeing some initiatives from these individual companies that are embracing from the farm to the consumer. And as we see those programs continue to expand, whether it's trying to create value across the chain and incorporate that in their messaging to consumers, what areas across the industry do you see some opportunities like that to continue to grow, where you have engagement of that messaging from the farm to the consumer and trying to help pull on those heartstrings a little bit that we're talking about?
There's so many products that still resonate with consumers. There's this sort of disconnect when, bread is bad, you have that message on the one side, and pizza's still pretty popular, and I don't think there's kind of a hotter food product over the last 5 years than Uncrustables. And, and there are a growing number of towns where you can buy a pretty decent baguette. And there's just so many products that continue to make people smile. And it's just sort of this Jekyll and Hyde existence that we continue to grapple with. This may or may not belong in this podcast, but I do want to ask you all to devote quite a bit of money every year to promotion of their product, but I believe most of that is for international. And I'm wondering whether the growers have that equation exactly where it ought to be. Am I framing that question in a semi-intelligent way?
You always frame it in an intelligent way, Josh, but I knew as soon as Aaron said that he was able to get you on the podcast, being the investigative reporter, journalist that you are, that you would be the one ended up asking the questions in this podcast. So I appreciate that. But I do think there's a lot more internal discussion than our grower leaders, not just states, but at the national level about, you mentioned the word taken for granted, right? If you look at, so right now the United States uses around 950 to 975 million bushels of wheat every year, and that so often by analysts or within the market is just referred to as static demand. And so historically, you knew that every year half of our wheat was going to be used and consumed domestically. And so if we're going to try to add value to the broader 30,000 foot view of our crop, where can we move the needle? And that's why you've seen such a heavy emphasis on trying to engage and compete in that international market to pull on that increased demand side where we couldn't necessarily do it at the domestic level because it was referred to as static. Where can we try to go from 800 million bushels being exported to potentially 900 million bushels being exported, and try to keep it from being 700 million bushels exported, and that piece being the component that you might be able to have an influence on to help create better value across the farm gate for farmers. But as we're seeing the industry continue to evolve, you're seeing definitely the global landscape of the wheat industry, global trade change over the last decade, where we are taking advantage of where we have logistical advantages now, not necessarily the North Africa market like we historically were 20 years ago. Where do we have quality buyers in Southeast Asia or consistent, favorable trade relationships with companies that you're seeing more and more somewhat segmented ways of how can farmers independently try to create value in relationships with domestic millers, whether it's on a variety basis or a management basis or whatever it might be that is going to flow into the domestic market. So you're starting to see that needle swing back a little bit into, if we are going to create value, it may not necessarily impact the entire market, but for individual farmers that are trying to increase their value of the product that they're producing, trying to engage the domestic market on a more significant way and delivering what they want, It's a great question, Josh, and I think we're at the beginning stage of seeing an evolution. And I know Aaron's mentioned on this podcast in the past, as we get more variety information or management information that specific wheat buyers for our domestic mills or our millers are wanting to make specific flours for customers beyond organic, but just doing it with conventional wheats, that you're gravitating into a dual marketing channels where you've got your commercial grain available, then maybe your higher value grains. And I do think that that's going to continue to evolve and create opportunities within our industry for farmers and for millers that are trying to differentiate their flours in a competitive marketplace.
It seems to me that a little bit of, sort of the regime of how this was set up in terms of how the dollars were going to be spent was created in the period in the early 70s. And I really don't know the exact history of U.S. Sweden and all these different organizations. But first of all, we thought the sky was the limit in terms of what could really happen to Kansas and U.S. wheat and how dominant we were going to remain seemingly forever in a way that really did not materialize. But, we thought, well, we're competing with the Canadians, and we're competing with the Argentinians and the Australians, and certainly not at that point, with the Europeans, but not at that point with the Ukrainians or the Russians. And now here, all these years later, we're suddenly realizing, okay, well, in the United States, we're competing with dairy, and we're competing with,
corn and soybeans and biofuels and all of it. We could do a whole nother conversation and podcast, which I hope we do someday, Josh. Yeah. But the history with it, so specifically the Kansas Wheat Commission was created in 1957. And at that time, it was at that period when those overseas marketing policies were put into place and those farmers putting those investments. It was right after World War II, and you had major reconstruction efforts that were happening in Europe. And it was farmers wanting to find a way to make sure that the products that we were producing had a way to participate in that major reconstruction efforts and getting our product overseas. And then even as that continued to evolve in the 70s and 80s, when you had global wheat buyers that were dominated by government buyers, not individual private buyers, how do we collectively had our resources to engage those country government buyers that were buying large quantities at a time? And so as that's evolved and you have less government buyers, you have more private buyers, you have a much more competitive global landscape, it is a period of transition that I do think a lot of our grower leaders are having discussions about, Josh. It's a great point.
Josh, well, gosh, it's great to have you. Thanks for sharing some of your experience and wisdom. Glad to have you on the podcast again. That was Josh Sosland, editor of Milling and Baking News and president of Sosland Publishing Company. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please share with your friends. If you want to hear previous episodes, go to wheatsonyourmind.com. Thanks for listening.